Plessy was ill, and it was Christmas Eve. Not so ill as to cause deep anxiety or require much attention. More was the pity. There would have been some consolation under those circumstances in not being very well. She was much too weak to get up from her little bed, too weak to trot along as she loved to in the clear white snow, or to join in any of the fun, which was all to take place away from home. Too weak to do anything but feel the misfortune and the mistake it was to be unwell in such a season. Then her sickness made no difference to anyone else. At least, although they all said they were sorry and looked sorry, everything went on just the same as if she had been quite well. There was Mrs. Cardigan's Christmas tree party, to which she and her brothers and sisters were always invited, going to take place just as usual, and there would be dancing and laughter and games and presents, exactly the same as there had been in the previous year, and for many years, when she was there to enjoy it all. Things didn't seem quite right to Plessy in some way. She could not understand it all, but she had a curious sort of feeling that because she was ill, things ought not to go on in precisely the same manner as they did when she was well. As she lay in her little bed under the nursery wall, she watched Nurse wash and dress Mabel and Charlie and Harry and little Rose in their best evening frocks and knickerbocker suits, and listened to their joyous anticipations of the party with a curious little sense in her heart of the wrongness of everything. Nurse had to constantly subdue the happy exclamations of the rest with the reminder, "Poor Miss Plessy is ill and can't bear any noise." Then came Papa's voice from the stairs, calling to Nurse, "The carriage is at the door. Aren't the little ones ready?" "In a minute, sir," Nurse responded. And then on Plessy's thin white cheek 4 pairs of soft warm lips were eagerly pressed, one after the other, and "Good night, Plessy. Don't be asleep when we come back," was whispered as the children hurried away. Nurse cleared the nursery of the children's things and set everything straight. Then she turned down the lamp, so that the white glow of the snow through the uncovered windows mingled with the soft yellow light. Plessy remembered the year before when she was one of the happy group below, the being muffled up in soft woolen and fur wraps by Mamma and Papa in the hall and lifted into the close carriage, the banging to of the door, the "All right" given to Jessup the coachman, and then the drive along the snow-covered road and up the long avenue of crystallized trees to the shining doorway of Mrs. Cardigan's big house, all the windows of which were ablaze with lights. Presently, in amongst the nursery shadows, Plessy's mamma glided. She was dressed in shimmering silk with flowers in her hair. She and Papa were going out to dine at the house of another friend. She too said, "Poor Plessy," but in lower and more pitiful tones than Nurse's. "Don't be lonely, little one. You will sleep and get strong for tomorrow, will you not? You must be sure to be well enough for Papa to carry you down to dinner, you know." Then came Papa himself, with his good-night kiss and injunctions to go to sleep right away, and forget that it was Christmas Eve. Plessy bravely kept back her tears until after her parents were gone, but she could not prevent the bright drops from falling then. Nurse brought her supper soon after, a cup of beef tea and some thin strips of dry toast, which Plessy had to swallow in spite of the lump in her throat, which kept growing bigger instead of smaller. When the cup was empty, Nurse straightened her pillows, tucked her up comfortably, put a fresh lump of coal on the fire, and turned the lamp very low. Then she bent over the little bed. "Now you'll go to sleep, little lamb, won't you?" Plessy knew that the nurse wanted to go downstairs to supper, and that they would be merry down below, because it was Christmas Eve, and there was no one in the house to be waited upon. So she answered meekly, "I shan't want anything else tonight, Nurse. You can go now." "You'll be more likely to sleep if there's nobody in the room, Miss Plessy," said Nurse, and left her. So this was how Plessy spent her Christmas Eve. How quiet the nursery was after Nurse went, with the still gleam of mingled fire and lamplight upon the old white pictured walls. The windows were covered now, and no snowshine came in from without. And the snow, lying thickly outside in the streets, softened the rumble of the wheels of vehicles that passed. Plessy's papa was a doctor, and lived almost in the centre of a large town, in a comparatively quiet street. The nursery was hardly ever free from noise, except when the little white beds ranged against the walls were all filled. Now they were empty, with smooth pillows that looked as though they were waiting for each little curly head. How loudly the clock ticked over the mantelpiece. Plessy had had no idea until then how very plainly it could make itself heard. It seemed almost to be speaking with the sharp click of its pendulum, if only she could have understood the language. Even the dropping of a cinder from the grate became a matter of importance now. For a long while, Plessy watched the shadows which the firelight cast upon the walls, tracing fanciful figures in their dim shapes. But she grew tired of this occupation and fell to thinking about Mrs. Cardigan's party of the year before and wondering if this one would be half as nice. No other lady ever gave such nice parties as Mrs. Cardigan did in the estimation of little folks. No other Christmas tree ever came up to hers, and to miss it was to miss the one pleasure of the winter for which no other could compensate. In the previous year, a young lady, a niece of Mrs. Cardigan's, had been visiting her, and she made an addition to the Christmas tree which gave great delight, in the shape of a waxen fairy doll for its highest pinnacle. Plessy remembered how little Rose Cardigan had drawn her aside during an interval in the dances, and communicated this fact to her. From one to another the news of the fairy doll flew through the room. Plessy recalled the thrill of anticipation which filled her own heart, and which was turned into a great longing when Rose further told her that the fairy doll was to be drawn for, and would become the absolute property of some little girl then present. Oh, if she might only be the fortunate little girl! Would there be a fairy of the tree this year, Plessy asked of herself, and if so, would she again be drawn for, and who would win her? She would have no chance, and the year before it had been just as likely that the doll would fall to her as to anyone else. She did not win her, but then she might have done. The memory of the doll floated into her heart and mind now. When supper was over and the great folding doors were flung open, revealing the large Christmas tree, blazing with innumerable tapers and laden with glittering toys, Plessy's eyes had sought the topmost spray at once for the fairy. There it was, poised upon one waxen foot by a wire. It was a lovely wax doll with streaming flaxen hair, upon which was set a crown of gold paper with 5 points. Its white gauze skirts were glittering with golden tinsel, and in its outstretched waxen arms it held a golden wand with a star and crescent at one end of it. The sweet face of the doll fairy, with its deeply fringed blue eyes, smiled down upon the upturned faces of all the little girls of the party, each of which had on it a longing to possess it. Plessy kept her eyes fixed upon that topmost twig of the tree. None of the toy fruit on the lower branches was to be compared for one moment with the doll. When George Cardigan brought round the bag containing the tickets for the drawing, Plessy slipped in her little trembling hand with a great, almost irrepressible wish swelling her heart. The tickets were made of cardboard, all cut exactly the same size, but on one of them was etched the figure of the doll, the rest all being blanks. The fortunate drawer of the etching became the possessor of the fairy from the tree. In her nervous eagerness, Plessy clutched one ticket and let it fall, then another and drew it out. When George passed on with the silken bag to the little girl next to her, she stole a timid and furtive glance at the bit of cardboard in her hand. The upper side was blank. With a thrill of fear, she turned it over. The prize of the drawing had not fallen to her. She looked up once more to the tree, but she could not see the doll. Her eyes were swimming with tears. It had fallen to the share of little Agnes Moore, a child whose father was very rich, whose nursery was full of dolls, and who did not need this addition to them. It was a cruel thought to little Plessy that Agnes could never care for the doll as she would have done. Her papa was a hard-working doctor, and there were already 5 little children in his nursery, and such toys as they had to amuse them were principally of home manufacture. Her best doll had only a composition face, and nothing to speak of in the way of hair. Plessy had felt a sort of pitiful contempt for this homely doll ever since she had brought home with her from Mrs. Cardigan's party the memory of the fair hair and blue eyes of the waxen fairy of the tree. And her own doll had seemed, on its part, to have had a fit of the sulks. It had never wanted to be played with since, and seemed fully to understand that its little mistress's heart had changed towards it. Slowly the hours ticked on, and at last nurse came up. She thought Plessy was asleep, and stepped softly so as not to awaken her. From under her drooping eyelids, Plessy watched her, thinking as she saw her bright eyes, "She has had a pleasant Christmas Eve." Nurse raked out the ashes from the grate so that a little blaze sprang up and fresh shadows flickered on the walls. Then she turned down the coverlet of each little bed and hung 4 little white-frilled nightdresses to the fire. She had hardly finished these preparations when there was a sharp ring at the house door, quickly followed by the tramping of 4 pairs of dancing feet up the stairs and voices talking about Plessy in no hushed tones. Nurse rushed to the door, and Plessy heard her whispering to them to be quiet and not awaken poor Miss Plessy. Plessy started upright in bed. "I am not asleep, nurse, and I want to hear all about the party." In rushed 4 little happy figures with tumbled hair and frocks, flushed faces and flashing eyes, and all talked at once, so that Plessy was quite bewildered. Mabel had a box in her hands which she placed on Plessy's bed, and all 4 were laden with toys, bonbons and trinkets. Mabel was by nature the most timid of the group, and it was some few minutes before she could make her little voice heard or attract Plessy's full attention. Tell me quickly," cried Plessy, above the eager noise of the boys who were displaying and explaining the novelty of their own Christmas tree spoils. "Was there a fairy doll of the tree, and who won it in the raffle?" "A fairy?" cried Charlie. "Of course there was, but who cares about that?" "Please!" exclaimed Mabel, pushing the long-shaped white box into a more conspicuous position before Plessy's eyes. "It's there. Mrs. Cardigan sent it to you, Plessy." "I say, Pless, wasn't it jolly of her?" put in Charlie. "She wouldn't have the doll drawn for at all, but she said there was a little girl who was ill and couldn't come to the party, and it should be sent away to her." "With Mrs. Cardigan's kind love," said Mabel, "and we are to tell you how very sorry she is that you have been lonely and ill on Christmas Eve." "Oh!" cried Plessy, with a gasp of joy unspeakable, and her fingers fluttered with awe and trembling over the white lid, too feeble just at first from the greatness of her surprise to lift it. "Come now, Master Henry, come now, Miss Mabel," cried Nurse. "It's time you were all in bed. Why, it's close on 10 o'clock, and Miss Plessy not asleep. However do you think she will be able to get up tomorrow?" Mabel lingered to say to her sister before following Nurse to be undressed, "Just look at her, Plessy. She's ever so much lovelier than the fairy doll was last year." Plessy drew aside the lid, and there lay the object of her dreamful longings, all glittering in white and gold, with blue-fringed eyes staring up placidly into her own. Slowly she lifted it out from its bed of soft wool. Slowly she examined it. It was perfect in every remembered possession, from pink face to waxen toes, from flowing hair to white gauze robes and starry wand. "Oh, how good of Mrs. Cardigan," she exclaimed inwardly, "but I won't forget who it was who put it into her heart to send the gift to me. Mamma says all kind thoughts come from him." She laid the little white doll down upon her pillow, closed her eyes and clasped her hands, while a fervent thanksgiving ascended to him, the Lord of this happy Christmas time. She had not fallen asleep when the distant sound of voices broke upon the frosty stillness of the air with the familiar carol, "Good Christian men, rejoice, rejoice." The last sound she heard was the ringing of the bells that ushered in the Christmas morn, and with their bright echoes in her heart, she wandered away into the land of dreams with her fairy doll of the Christmas tree.